safer chemicals, how retailers can improve chemicals management. My name's Sally Edwards. I direct the Sustainable Products Initiative at the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, and I work with the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council. And this is we have one of our work groups for the GC3 is on engaging retailers in the adoption of safer products. And so this is a webinar series, and we have a webinar series throughout the year, and this is one of the webinars in that series. And I'm really delighted that both Mark Rossi and Roger McFadden have agreed to speak on the webinar today. Mark Rossi will go first. Mark is the co-director of Clean Production Action and the co-chair of BizNGO. Mark develops innovative collaborations, programs, and tools to advance the use of safer chemicals and materials. In 2006, he founded the BizNGO to bring thought leaders together to define best business practices in selecting safer alternatives to chemicals and materials of concern to human health and the environment. Mark was also a developer of the green screen that many of you may know about. And Roger McFadden is a senior scientist and a vice president at Staples. Roger helps to inform, guide, and advise Staples on a variety of environmental, chemical, and sustainability issues. He drafted Staples' first formal safer chemicals policy, and Roger actively participates in both the GC3 and BizNGO. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of them. Because there are a number of participants on the webinar, we've muted all the lines, but we really hope that you will ask questions, and you'll see a Q&A box located in the drop-down control panel at the top of the screen, and please type in questions as you have them, and then we will get those questions answered once the presentations are completed. So we look forward to hearing your questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark Rossi.
Thanks, Sally, and good afternoon to everyone, and morning to those of you on the West Coast. Sarah, could you put that, it's at the end of the PowerPoint, could you just put it to the beginning, and then I'll start from there. There we go. Thanks. And thanks, Sarah and Sally, for setting up this webinar. So last week, it feels like ages ago, but BizNGO released the Guide to Safer Chemicals, and the subtitle, Implementing the BizNGO Principles for Safer Chemicals, is what it's about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly walk you through really high-level points around the guide, and then I'm going to, take some of the learnings that we had in developing the guide and apply them to retailers. So this is somewhat less of a detailed walkthrough of the guide and more of thinking about, well, how would the guide be applied to and be useful to the retail sector. So the guide starts the journey to writing the guide, and it's all about the journey to mount sustainability, which was a term coined by Ray Anderson at Interface, right? That it's a journey, it's a process to implementing sustainability, and certainly that's really one of the themes underlining the guide. But so in 2008, BizNGO released a set of principles for safer chemicals, and in short, we've got 4 principles. They're here on the screen: know and disclose product chemistry, assess and avoid hazards, commit to continuous improvement, and then support public policies and industry standards or voluntary initiatives that advance the above 3 principles. And in writing those principles, many organizations said, well, in spirit, we're with you. We're really curious, well, what does it mean to implement these principles, recognizing that very few organizations are going to do all of these things in total, and we recognize that up front. And we set them up as being visionary principles, and you can see there's a couple dozen endorsers that are here on the page. There's more on our website of all the endorsers. It's a mix and really reflects the mix of who is in BizNGO, which is a mix of retailers, electronics firms, companies selling products into the building product sector, the healthcare sector, and the outdoor industry sector as well. And I think, certainly to the healthcare sector a lot, and obviously the retail sector, but the healthcare sector really closely resembles, the retailer sector in many ways as being a really far downstream of manufacturing and really being a purchaser, right, of products. So using the guide, the guide is set up to help measure internal performance, identify areas of performance improvement, and track progress. It provides a means for benchmarking performance. It can be used externally to explain or report on corporate performance and progress, and I'll say a little bit about that. It can also be used to create your own chemical management system. So, for example, I have been working very closely with the Outdoor Industry Association, and they've been creating a chemical management framework, and early iterations of the guide helped inform the development of their system. So, we see this as having many uses. There's no singular use to the guide. We expect organizations to either adopt it in part or to go and revise it as it works for their organizations. The way it's structured, and this is something that's important. One thing about the guide is it really is a living resource, and you can dig into the guide, but there's lots of examples of practices that relate to the different benchmarks in the guide. And in that way, I think it's a real resource to understand, what organizations are doing around implementing each of these principles. So we set out pathways to safer chemicals based on those 4 principles. Principle number 1 gets divided into 2 parts. So we separated out know and disclose because they are different activities. Then for each principle, right, we're setting a relative benchmarks, and I call them relative because this is not, a scorecarding system. We played around with providing points for each action so that you could add everything up and show direct progress. And we said, no, let's get this out as an example of mapping out best practices on these pathways to implementing these principles, but it's not about absolutes. So this is very much, we put this out as something to get feedback on, to work with other organizations on, and to revise and upgrade as we go forward. And so, for example, you could have almost different guides for different sectors, like the retailing sector. Then it specifies actions for each benchmark. I mentioned it presents examples of tools and business practices, and then suggests steps for downstream users. And so one thing, here this is the logic, that's Pierre Rodin, a sculpture by Pierre Rodin there, is the logic of the principles are that you've got a set of principles that apply directly to products, and then the rest are at more of an organizational level. So the idea is around chemicals, right? You need to know the chemicals in products. We extend that out to processes and to the sources of feedstocks. Right? Then you take those chemicals, you'd assess them against some set of criteria and identify chemicals of concern. Right? You'd set up programs to avoid and reduce those chemicals of concern. And along the pathway, there's a commitment and action to actually disclosing chemicals in products or processes. And we've seen, and in developing the principles and the guide, right, we saw examples of these practices occurring in organizations. And then at the organizational level, there's a commitment to continuous improvement and support for public policies and voluntary initiatives. And we've seen that type of work, but I just wanted to point out, like, there's a set of principles that are applied to products, and then those that are at the organizational level. And I'm really going to focus much more at the organizational level. Okay, so the ideal, and this is, so you can go and you can get the guide at bizngo.org. And so here's along trailhead, base camp, high camp summits. For each principle, there's a set of actions, and then for each of those actions, right, we provide examples of what organizations are doing. So, right, under know, the ideal is, right, you know all the chemicals and products, all the chemicals that are being used in supply chains and their feedstock sources. And by knowing, it means either you know it directly or you have access to that information if you wanted it. And that's something we were agnostic about, like, do you do this internally or do you do this through a third party? So we don't specify, and we don't say which one is appropriate or not. It's right. We're leaving that up to the organization. But the idea, right, is that you are able to know all the chemicals and products, processes, and feedstocks if you want it. There would be disclosure, and for the retailing sector, we actually said, right, for disclosure, that really wasn't applying for the far downstream users like retailers. It'd be more, well, your suppliers would disclose that information, not the retailer, for example, would directly disclose that information. And similarly, like for healthcare. So we said, like, disclose for retailers wasn't applicable. There's, the assess and avoid, improve, support, which I had mentioned before. And so, right, so that's the ideal. But so what does that look like in practice? And thinking of this as getting started in retail. And this is something where we see in many different sectors of getting started in terms of addressing this issue of chemicals in products as a downstream user. First of all, it's like, well, where do you start? I mean, many, retail sectors, right? Many different products on the shelves, right? Well, which ones are priority products, and then what are the priority chemicals? So you could choose, right, to choose, either area. I just highlighted, children's products in part because you already have legislative initiatives in different states targeting chemicals in children's products. Similarly with cosmetics and cleaning products, are all areas where you've seen some action at a regulatory level. So, right, retailers need to be certainly paying attention to chemicals in those products, and there's no doubt other products as well, depending on your company. And then what are the priority chemicals? Well, there's so many different ways of targeting priority chemicals. The ones that I've listed here are ones that have been typically targeted by retailers or by regulators or by purchasers in different sectors. And so you have the organohalogens, for example, the brominated flame retardants, right, have been under scrutiny. You've got PVC has been under scrutiny in products. You've got the phthalates, bisphenol A, formaldehyde. But there's many ways of choosing, which priority chemicals are started, and many different sectors have, from that, right, created restricted substances lists. And one note about the guide is it's all beyond compliance. We start from the point that compliance is already happening, not before that. And an example of how this has played out that I'm just going to throw out to you is the Healthier Hospitals Initiative. Many of you may have heard of this. This is an initiative of commitments that hospitals are making. And it's a good example of what I just pointed out, right, of how do you get started. So this group of hospitals, which includes Kaiser Permanente and Dignity Health and many others, said, okay, well, we're going to focus on cleaning products, we're going to focus on medical products, and we're going to focus on building interior products. So green cleaners was Green Seal or Eco Logo. The medical devices targeted the use of PVC and DHP in medical devices for reduction. And then the interior products focused on a set of chemicals which mirrors the list that I just provided: halogenated flame retardants, formaldehyde, perfluorinated compounds, and PVC. So this is an example of an initiative that I would say, in many ways would parallel, a starting point for retail, right? Choose some priority products, choose some priority chemicals in those products based on, right, it's going to be a mixture of hazard and exposure. And, a lot of these chemicals are persistent bioaccumulative toxics or break down into PBTs through their use, their release into the environment, or through incineration. So, and there's many different routes, right, to choosing these initial priority products and restricted substances lists, and organizations are choosing the ones that best fit their needs. And there's no right or wrong answer to this. I mean, it really is a matter of getting started. And so there's many examples of, starting with the RSL chemicals, right, and it leads to, and this is one thing that you'll see around the principles, and it's a heuristic, and what of this, right, know, assess, avoid, and disclose, as well as improve and support policies and industry initiatives, it's a heuristic that you can apply to many different set of work around this issue of managing chemicals as downstream users. And that's something that is by design, right? Because we're building this up from practice. So even though, and I apply this later in terms of work that's being done around the Zero Discharge initiative, which I'll say more about, but that initiative doesn't use this same framework, but you can go and look at all their actions, and they've got like 20 different actions that they've said that they're going to do, and you can look at them and you can bin them into these categories of know, assess, avoid, and disclose. And so it really parallels a whole set of work. And there's a huge amount of work going on around restricted substances. And in fact, God, it must be like 5 years old, 4 or 5 years ago, GC3 created a list, sort of took a look at all the restricted substances lists of many different participants in GC3 and created this document. And that's one thing, like, so we put into like, a hyperlink into the BizNGO guide to that list, and we'll set it up on a website so that you can readily access, information like this. And I've just put it up some examples, some companies, or Levi, and you have the American Apparel Footwear Association has its RSL list, which is used by its members. Many organizations are using the ChemSec SYN list as an example of, what would be an RSL chemical. But one of the issues with RSLs is they are very limited to the specific lens that an organization takes. So what I'm going to show you is a slide that was developed by the Healthy Building Network in looking at restricted substance lists for different initiatives in the building sector. But the point that this slide makes is that, well, when you start with a restricted substance list, it doesn't mean that there aren't other chemicals of high concern that you may have missed, because it's not criteria driven, it's driven by the lens at which any organization starts. So this is NC is lead new construction, starts out with a set of chemicals, and then this is the green guide for healthcare, right? It overlaps with some of the lead for new construction chemicals, add some more. This is lead for healthcare, right? And a lead pilot on chemicals, right? So now you see some overlaps and some new chemicals coming in. This is a living building challenge, which is another initiative, and they created a set of red list chemicals, again, overlaps and differences. And then you've got the EPA's chemical action plan chemicals, some overlap there. This is the Perkins and Will, which is an architectural and design firm, created its own red list, and then it updated that list. So you see, again, some overlaps and some differences. And let's see, we have the Living Building Challenge watch list. So the Living Building Challenge expanded their list. They're a similar organization to like the U.S. Green Building Council. And so the point is that unless you develop a set of comprehensive criteria for identifying chemicals of concern, you're always at almost call it the whim of, what's the next chemical of concern, right? Because you didn't develop a set of replicable criteria for identifying chemicals. And so this is the limit, right? So the RSL is a starting point, and I think it's a very good starting point for the retail sector to be thinking about chemicals and products, but really in the guide to get beyond what we're calling trailhead, you need to move beyond RSLs and you need to move to you have to apply systems to getting at these questions of chemicals and products. So as you move beyond RSLs, right, there becomes a fuller commitment to knowing all the chemicals and products or processes. There's a process for evaluating these chemicals, right, clear set of criteria for identifying chemicals of concern. And then also, clear criteria for identifying safer alternatives. And I think, some of the most exciting work, especially, for me personally, is that point at which you get away from, oh, well, we don't want this, we don't want carcinogens and PBTs and reproductive toxicants into the product, to, well, we want this, right? We want this type of chemistry in our product, right? This is the chemistry that we want. And two examples of that highlight HP, but Nike has also done some great work around specifying green chemistry, what they actually want. So I'm not going to run you through this flow chart, but this is Seagate's system for collecting full chemical and material disclosure from suppliers. So this is a point out to make a point that companies are collecting full chemical ingredient in products. And so Seagate is a manufacturer of hard drives, and they've got a system in place where they're collecting all the information of the chemicals in their products. Now, there's other companies that are choosing, and many of you are familiar because you're with GC3, with the auto sector's International Material Data System, which is Collect IMDS, which is collecting chemicals in products that are going into the auto sector, right? So you've got a third party collecting this information. So there's different routes to getting to that information, but the point is, and the trajectory here is that suppliers are becoming aware that they need to know the chemicals in their products, and they have to have some way of sharing that to their buyers, and how, what that level of information is going to vary. Another initiative, I don't know how many of you have heard about this one. This is called the Health Product Declaration form, and it's modeled on the Environmental Product Declaration form. And this was released at Greenbuild a couple weeks ago before Thanksgiving. And this is an initiative to collect full ingredient information on products that are sold into the building sector. And this is their form to provide this information. So again, just highlighting that there's much more activity and demands for knowing the chemicals in products, and I would also say in processes. This is a very interesting example from Whole Foods. They've got their Ecoscale for cleaning products. So now this is really interesting. This is the retail sector, and they said, well, we want to create criteria for the cleaning products that are sold in our store. And I think this is a good example of tying together many of the themes that I already highlighted about knowing chemicals and products, disclosing them, and avoiding chemicals of high concern. So, and I'll just pop this up here, but this is their whole Ecoscale. And I'm just going to point out a couple of points here, right? Transparency, this is disclosure, right? So to sell into Whole Foods, you need to provide full disclosure of ingredients on packaging, right? So that's a set of clear criteria that they've set up for a product category. They've set up ingredient hazards, right, which just gets the assess part, and they say, well, to get to yellow, an orange, no significant environmental or safety concerns, and then it goes down to no moderate environmental or safety concerns. Not quite sure, how they're evaluating the chemistries here, but they've set up these criteria. And then, what you have down, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but then there's many different chemicals of concern that are targeted, for example, formaldehyde donors, but you'll also see it starts to get into the feedstocks at the bottom. What is the source, the raw material source of the chemicals that are going into the cleaning products, right? And at the green level, they say, well, it has to be plant and mineral-derived ingredients only, with no petroleum-derived ingredients, right? So this now extends all the way through to the source of the feedstocks. And so, this is an example, right, of what can be done at the retail sector for a specific product category, and it very much aligns with the different principles for safer chemicals. So here's another example, and I think this is interesting. This is HP. They've created a whole materials assessment program, and this is something that's really important as you start to work with suppliers to get them away from this, well, don't use that, don't use this, avoid that chemical, to, well, what do we want? And so what HP is doing as they phase out brominated flame retardants, BFRs, and polyvinyl chloride, PVC, is they're saying, well, we want you to evaluate those chemicals using the green screen, and we're going to select chemicals that score better in the green screen as alternatives, right, because we want to avoid regrettable substitutions. So now the green screen becomes a framework for communicating to suppliers about what preferred chemistry is. And that's really powerful. HP also has a whole framework by which they evaluate chemicals internally and place them in the context of looking at both hazard, life cycle concerns, and exposure concerns. And that framework that they created, they call it Integrated Alternatives Assessment, very much mirrors the BizNGO's Chemical Alternatives Assessment Protocol. And so this is an example as you get to assess and avoid and how you think of getting to the really high points with suppliers. It's not just to say, well, don't use bisphenol A in the product. When you replace bisphenol A, how do you know that you're replacing it with a safer alternative, right? And for HP, they say, well, give us the green screen assessments of the alternatives. So here's an example. I just pulled out a couple points from the Roadmap to Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals. So this is an initiative of the apparel and footwear sector. A number of firms have signed on to this, including Nike, Levi Strauss, Adidas, Puma, Li Ning, are companies that have signed on to the Roadmap to Zero Discharge. The bulleted items here are from their initiative. I've gone and sort of binned them into the BizNGO principles, right? No chemicals across the life cycle, right? Their goal is to create a generic, comprehensive inventory of all chemicals used in textile manufacturing, right? The process chemistry that's being used to make the fabrics and dye the fabrics that are going into their products. Right, then they're going to identify and agree to a screening tool for chemical hazards. For example, like HP said, okay, we're going to use the green screen. The roadmap groups are going to agree to a screening tool, and then establish a plan to evaluate the chemical inventory by intrinsic hazard and establish a sector-wide list of hazardous chemicals, right? So you know all the chemicals in the product, principle 1A there, and then you create a screening tool for evaluating them, and then you identify your chemicals of high concern to take action. And so that very much mirrors, where we've been going with the principles, and it's here in this roadmap. And I think there's a lot to be learned there. So I am getting close to the end here for Sarah and Sally. The last principle, I just wanted to quickly highlight ways in which organizations can use the guide. And this principle, the commit to continuous improvement, is really about setting goals and then publicly reporting out on them. So we did a pilot of the guide, an early iteration of the guide to safer chemicals with Dignity Health, and then they went and took the results from that pilot and they put it in their sustainability report. We went through and looked at where they're at in terms of each one of the principles. This was actually a beta version, so how they align up with the principles has actually changed somewhat. But they took that and they put that out publicly to say, okay, here's what we're doing. And as you can see, as a healthcare organization, they're really at the RSL level with principles number 1 and number 2. They've taken this action to report on their progress in principle number 3, and they're very active in supporting initiatives to advance this work, both in terms of voluntary initiatives and public policies. And I'll just say a little bit about that one. And this one is very important as you think of a sector like the retail sector about like, well, how do you get some much greater leverage and accelerate this work to address chemicals and products that is really challenging, and how do you get more resources to do this, right, in a really resource-constrained environment that we all operate in? Well, one way of doing this, right, is through collaborations with others. So this arrow that I popped up on the bottom is put into it's in the guide for each of those principles, and it has a lot more detail than that high-level graphic that I had before of the principles. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just to highlight, like, here's some examples of voluntary initiatives and public policies where companies are getting engaged. So one is the Outdoor Industry Association's Chemical Management Framework, which I think is a really good set of work on creating a sector-wide approach to chemicals management. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition has adopted the materials index that Nike created, and is likely to adopt some or part or whole of what the Outdoor Industry Association does. But many of you, I think on the phone, have been involved or know of these initiatives. And these are really important, right, to leveraging a whole community to accelerate this work. U.S. Green Building Council, LEED version 4, they're revising their criteria. Organizations are engaging in that. There's a set of material resource credits that they've put into that LEED version 4, and in fact, comments are due today, something I will be doing as soon as the webinar is over. The Sustainability Consortium, another initiative, right? Many of you are engaged in that. And then the California Safer Consumer Product Regulations, right? You want to make sure that government does this work in a way that's both effective for implementation and effective for advancing this work, and is done in a way that is done in the basis of sound science. And so you've got all these initiatives, and I think it's really, what we found is advancing the work to safer chemicals requires that there's this engagement with a broader community beyond what's going on inside a company. And there's many examples of what organizations are doing. So moving on to the conclusions, so the list of chemicals of high concern facilitates rapid screening of chemicals, right? You do need an RSL to start out this process, but there's limits to RSL as the complexity of the slide, that complex Venn diagram slide illustrated. Getting beyond trailhead requires that you have systems. I highlighted, what HP is doing. HP is using Hazard, right, to facilitate setting priorities, communicating with suppliers, and selecting safer alternatives, and they've been using the green screen to do that. And to this last point, right, a collective voice of downstream users is essential to really growing this global movement and to maximizing the limited amount of resources we all have for this work. And so in closing, next steps for the guide, it's definitely an evolving resource. We look forward to your input into this. Each one of these cells on this over here on this graphic are going to be filled and put on a website with examples of activities that are happening. We did that in the existing report, but we know we just touching on the tip of the iceberg of activities that are happening there. Of course, as you get closer to Summit, there are fewer activities reflecting the challenge of the work at Summit. You can use the guide for comprehensive chemicals management training. We will use the guide in trainings, and we already did that in a green screen training in Chicago. This is an area that was identified at the BizNGO annual meeting of interest, is training in the use of the green screen and the guide. An option to consider is piloting the guide with BizNGO. We did some pilots earlier, and we'll continue to test it and update it and make it more useful. And you can start to publicly report on performance in relationship to the benchmarks. I think, and sector benchmarking, those are two areas where you're going to start to see some more activity. And I think like the outdoor industry sector is one sector where there's a lot of activity. Healthcare with the Healthier Hospitals Initiative is an example of a set of work in that area. And of course, I just want to give thanks to all of the folks that have worked on this project with me. Sherry Peel and Beverly Thorpe are co-authors of the report. and the BizNGO Chemicals Work Group, which advised the development of this product over the past 4 years, and there's 20 plus people who have all been engaged in providing feedback in one form or another over the guide. So the guide would not be possible without all their work. So Sally and Sarah, thanks so much, and I'll turn it back turn this over to Roger.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I wanted to also express our appreciation at Staples to Sarah and Sally for helping to host this today, and also to Sherry and Beverly for their great work in building this tool, and to all the folks, some of you may even be on the phone, who have participated and helped to create this incredible tool that we view at Staples as very important to help guide us. So we take control of the slides here, see how this works. There we go. Whoops. Before we begin looking at this particular tool and how we apply it at Staples and are beginning to implement to our chemicals policy strategies, let me say that chemicals are a key element of the global economy, and certainly to us retailers who are engaged today in this space. For you retailers that are listening today, you know what I mean. There's a lot of activity on both the supply side and demand side of the supply chain, and we're kind of in the middle of that, and sometimes feel like a referee. And so it's great to have assistance like we're getting with this tool and the folks who are behind this tool. But it's important for us to recognize that the target here is not to do away with chemicals. So the idea here isn't to develop bans and regulatory bans. In fact, that's probably the messiest way to do this, and probably the most expensive for businesses and society. The best way is to develop safer alternatives, to identify those and validate those, and then to make the current chemistries obsolete, if you will. But chemicals have been very important to us in our businesses. They make great products. So chemicals have been very valuable in a whole lot of different ways. So we don't want to forget that they're important. But at the same time, we are recognizing with emerging science, there's a whole lot of emerging medical information and scientific studies that are being done that keep reminding us that not all chemicals are created equal. And they may differ in a number of places, and I've listed a few of those here: hazard traits, human health, and ecotoxicity endpoints, and so forth. We're quite concerned about those because those are the way these chemicals affect us, not just specific to the product, but all the way through the life cycle, from the way the particular chemicals are made all the way to their degradation and combustion byproducts. And we need to begin to take a fuller look at the impacts of chemicals, not just at a product-specific level, but understanding how those impact our society as a whole. And so we see this tool and applaud this guide, because it begins to frame for us some consistency in the way that we look at this. Keep in mind this is a tool, not a policy. So it's not laying out policies for us retailers. It's really helping to guide our policies as we begin to develop those. Staples adopted and endorsed these particular 4 guiding principles a number of years ago because we recognized that this was a good way to begin to look at chemicals. Now, it doesn't mean that we were doing all of these things, but we knew we should be committed to doing them, and we needed to begin to work towards doing these. And we have worked diligently over the last several years to begin to wire this together. And so this keeps us focused on what we're trying to do here. We're trying to know and understand and disclose product chemistries. When we talk about disclosure, that scares some businesses because they think we're talking about taking all their secret information and sharing it to the whole world. And what we're really talking about is disclosing throughout the supply chain one tier to the next, and sometimes that requires 2 and 3 tiers of suppliers to get information before we can get enough information to make informed decisions with. So we felt that we needed a policy within Staples to begin to guide us in a more specific way, both internally in the way that we make decisions for our own organization around chemicals, but also to help guide our suppliers. There's 2 things that most of us retailers know that we must have, and there's probably more than these 2, but there's 2 critical things to a successful retailer. One is a sustainable customer base that comes back to us and recognizes that we're a place that they want to shop and a place they want to go to buy products, that we're a trusted advisor, if you will, and they want us to be that for them. The other one is our suppliers. They're extremely important to us. So we need to be careful that we make an orderly transition, right, so that we don't disrupt our relationships with our suppliers. They're rocky sometimes just simply because of the difficulty of moving items and pricing items and price increases and all kinds of regulatory encumbrances at times. So we have a lot going on between us and our suppliers, and we have many suppliers. When you look at retailers the size of Staples and some of you who are on this call and others, but even if you're a small company, you still have to deal with an awful lot of dialogue with your suppliers, and they're extremely important to us. So we wanted to frame for our suppliers and our customers what we were trying to do here. So what we're really trying to do here is to, our customers want us to provide, and we want to provide to them products that are inherently safer for human and environmental health and that address environmental impacts throughout their life cycle. So that's what this is all about for us. It's trying to listen to our customers and respond to their needs. The policy is detailed, but I've just pulled out a few things to share with you that I think will, if you're not already doing this internally in your organizations, you may want to begin to think a little bit about how you'll tackle this. The first thing is we need information, and the information we get we need to trust, and we need to know that it's accurate and comprehensive as possible, that it's based on science, that it's evidence-based. So we're requesting from our suppliers product chemistry and hazard endpoint data. And we believe that will help, of course, we're guided by the Safer Chemicals Guide here in that regard. Secondly, we intend to, because we have so many products, hundreds of thousands of them, that have tens of thousands of chemicals in these different products, we can't tackle it all at once, so we need to create a prioritization. So we will begin to do, as Mark had talked about, looking at, in our case, we're going to look at hazard endpoints, and we're going to establish some kind of priority around hazard endpoints and begin to connect that with the products themselves, how they're used, who will be using them, who's exposed to them. All of those things are important to us. Then we're going to create this collaboration with suppliers. We believe the solution is in working with the suppliers that we do business with now, but it might be that they may not be the right supplier, but it may take us a while before we know that. But we want to give them first crack at this because we think they have earned that. They've been good suppliers to us, and we want to give them first chance. But at the end of the day, if we can't accomplish our objectives through the suppliers we have, we'll have to look at least at some new suppliers who maybe bring some new thinking to the front. So this collaboration we're creating currently with our suppliers, having dialogues with them, talking about some realistic timelines. Then we will plan to develop a scorecard with the suppliers. If you remember, Mark talked about one of the advantages to this particular tool is it begins to set some benchmark performance and measure internal performance, and we'd like to do that with our suppliers. So why do we support the use of this guide? Well, I have a quote over on the right-hand side. I won't read that to you. This is something we provided for the press release for this particular guide when it was announced last week. But let me run you through the 4 things that we think, and reasons that we use it, and maybe reasons that you may want to consider beginning to use it as well. First of all, it's pragmatic. It's a pragmatic tool. It's built around reality. It's built around the way businesses think and do business now. It's not asking us to reinvent our businesses. It's not asking us to change existing infrastructures. It really aligns with the way we think. It's open and inclusive process. It's transparent. Transparency is important in this whole supply chain. So, when Mark and his team and all of their colleagues worked on this, they asked for a wide range of stakeholder involvement, including downstream users and businesses, which sometimes get missed and don't always, their voice is not always heard in this when you look at other initiatives that are out there that have tackled pieces of this before. So we really think that's valuable. Thirdly, it proactively responds to the growing supply chain demand for more ingredient disclosure and transparency. So it's a proactive way for us to begin to go after the information. And the cool part of it is we can start where we want, we can go at the pace that we want, and I guess I shouldn't say that we want, but that we're able to do with the resources we have within our businesses. That's really important, to not force small businesses to go quicker than they can economically afford to do or be able to do. And we think this guide allows that because of this kind of trailhead to summit kind of incremental continuous improvement model. And lastly, creates common language. We need to develop common language. We speak in different languages about the same things, and it's confusing to suppliers. Many times it's not fair to them because one of us retailers asks for this and another one asks for that, and we probably all need this and that, but we need to begin to create, and maybe the health product declaration is a good example of a tool that's emerged recently that may begin to standardize the way that we communicate between merchants to suppliers, between businesses to business, between businesses to customer, between business and government, and on and on and on. I think you get it, and you will know how to apply this tool as you begin to maybe do an analysis of it in your own organization. And then my last few comments here are really framed around why are we doing this in the first place. And if you notice the little teeny hand on top there, to me that's what it's all about, at least me personally, my grandchildren. Maybe you don't have grandchildren yet. All of us are grandchildren. But nevertheless, we have future generations after we're gone. And we view it as important to invest in those generations just as much as we invest in our current businesses. If you really think about it, that little hand can be a customer of ours in the future. That little hand right there can represent the leader in a major corporation. It can be maybe a president, maybe head of a university, or who knows, maybe an executive director of an NGO. But whatever that little represents, that little hand, that's what this is all about. And everybody wins when we move to safer chemistries. And that's not to say that all the chemistries today are unsafe. And for those who like to kind of go to that extreme, I will challenge them to say that we have to find a way to do this together. And so I have always been an advocate and will continue to be that many of the solutions in this are going to come from the chemical industry itself. So us retailers can do an awful lot to influence that by beginning to demand from our suppliers certain things, laying it out for these companies so that they can go back to their base suppliers, which often are represented by chemical companies, and say, hey guys, invest your dollars, invest your profits, invest invest in safer chemistries, because that's where we want to be. And then you can be the one who, as a business, benefit from that. And by the way, I will tell you that off the record, I guess we're on the record, but a little off the record, I believe I've seen some movement in that direction by some of those chemical companies. And it's not always reflected by the chemical associations that speak on their behalf sometimes, but nevertheless, I am seeing some movement in that area, and I'm very encouraged by some of the discussions I'm hearing. And Mark, there's some chemical companies engaged in some of the things that you and your colleagues are working on, and I will just say that I applaud that and encourage that, and that kind of collaboration is the way we're going to ultimately solve this problem. So it really creates shared value for consumers, for community, and for company. We all get this shared value. So when you do that, you can't lose because everybody's going to win in this. Suppliers are able to leverage their innovation and differentiation. So as companies come up with solutions for some of these problems we have today with chemicals in our products that are out there today that consumers don't want there anymore, or regulators are trying to remove, whatever it might be, we can encourage, be a good place for those suppliers to sell their goods, and they can leverage that differentiation. Chemicals of concern become obsolete as they're replaced, so we don't have to regulate them out of commerce. They can be moved out of commerce the same way other things get out of commerce. They become obsolete someday because they're replaced by something that consumers view as better. They help protect our human health. There's a lot of connection being developed today around in science and some studies that indicate that there are certain chemicals that create problems for us humans, and we need to take that seriously and talk about it and dialogue about it and start moving forward with it. And then lastly, this idea of natural and built environment. Sometimes we ask people what their view of the environment is, and they really think that it's all outdoors. So they think of trees and they think of water and waterfalls, and those are all important things, but this goes beyond just natural resources here. It goes into the idea that we live in buildings and inside environments most of the time. We work there, and we need to be just as concerned about the indoor environment as we are the outdoor environment. So let me leave it there and just say, Mark, and to your team, congratulations on this outstanding tool. We at Staples value it very positively, and we look forward to, as you begin to go forward with it and implement, I know you'll improve it along the way, and those improvements will come, I'm sure, from some of those on the call today that will engage. So thank you very much. So I'll hand it back to Sally.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Roger. Those were both excellent presentations. And I want to say to the participants on the webinar, we have about 6 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, which is there's a drop-down menu at the top of your screen. And I do have one question here, which is someone who wrote in and said, we have an RSL, but then there are a lot of chemicals we use that aren't on the RSL because they weren't on any of the authoritative lists. And how do we know that those chemicals are safe?
So that's a really good question, and I mean, if the chemicals aren't on any of these RSL lists, I mean that's pretty incredible. Just because, I mean, we've done a list of lists compilation, and there's close to 2,000 chemicals, and I think there's been talk of the California Safer Consumer Product Regulations having a list of 1,500 chemicals, and Washington State and Maine have all started with similar lists. So when you compile these lists of like IR, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and similar lists, you start to get up to quite a number. So that's one. But if you're beyond the list, which is a great place to be, then the next step is to start to go through, and then it's much more tedious, which is to run through some type of quick assessment of those chemicals, and there's a couple of routes for doing that. One is a tool developed by Washington State, which is called QCAT, Quick Chemical Assessment Tool. I saw that a couple of folks from the Works are on the phone. The Works have a great database system. The Healthy Building Network, Pharos, Chemical and Material Library is another quick assessment tool. But then once you're beyond these quick chemical assessments and these tools that have broad-based lists, then you're into really hiring a toxicologist to go through and evaluate those chemicals to understand, how well or what are the potential human and environmental health concerns with those chemicals. And that's something that, the Green Screen does that. We work with Tox Services, NSF International, Cyvera. Those are among many firms that can do that type of assessment. So what I just laid out is sort of a tiered set of evaluation where you go from lists to quick assessments of the literature based on some databases that might be readily available to hiring toxicology firms or hiring your own toxicologist.
Roger, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Mark did a nice job there. Thanks.
Okay. Does anyone have any other, I don't see any additional questions, but I guess one other question, Mark, is how, what's the best way to use the green screen in combination with the guide?
Well, the way that the green screen links in is in the assess and avoid hazards. So there is that one graphic where we laid over the mountain, like the assess and avoid graphic. And that the green screen kicks in there around base camp and high camp, which is as you go and evaluate, the easiest way to look at it is as you go to evaluate an alternative to, let's say, the brominated flame retardants, and you say, well, I want to make sure that I don't go to end up with a regrettable substitution, then there's an application for the green screen. So the green screen fits within that assess and avoid framework, and it also becomes a tool for communicating to suppliers about the preferred chemistry. And I think that's one of the really innovative parts that I've recently seen in terms of the use of the green screen, which is it becomes a clear form of communication to suppliers of expectations of the purchaser, in this case, HP.
Yeah, and I would say that, this is Roger, and I would say that one of these strategies for us is to move away from this idea of talking about the bad and move as quickly as possible to lists of safer materials. So we're working diligently with our suppliers to accumulate a list of materials and then try to map those across to products that we think either maybe they're not on priority today, but they will be the next stage of priority, so that we can give a heads up to suppliers and say, if you're interested, before we get to you, you may want to look at these materials and see if any of them are relevant to your need. That's what green screen can help us do. Green screen can help us not necessarily make the decision for us, but it can give the information to us in a real clear manner so that we can begin to squeeze out those lists of that white list, if you will, of materials, and then propagate that across the supplier base, and frankly, not only across suppliers, but across customers too, because we have a fair amount of very large customers that are pushing us very hard to remove chemicals out of our supply chain that we sell to them, so we can help them as well.
Roger, we're just at 3 o'clock, but I want to ask one follow-up question. Is that list of the white list, as you refer to it, do you have a set of criteria that you use to determine what would be a safer chemical or material?
Yeah, we're working on that now. That's the big challenge, and I think, Mark, if you wanted a challenge tossed your direction, it would be to move in the direction of taking the green screen data itself and begin to squeeze out some criteria that can help the retailers and other businesses do exactly what Sally just asked about. We're working on that. I can't share all the detail of the criteria. Sally could just tell you that's important to us, because just simply listing a chemical on a white list isn't good enough for us. We really need to know, like EPA, DFE, for instance, is beginning to now list on their website chemicals, and so that could begin to be at least the foundation of where we begin to build some of these lists. I know Nike's been doing some work in that space as well, and we want to do that, and hopefully some other of our colleagues will do the same. But it does need to be built around very specific criteria.
Well, thank you. I think that's the challenge that many of us on the call are facing as we move forward. And I want to thank Roger and thank Mark and thank Sarah for setting up the call. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good day, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.